4,000 years later. 6.5 hours later. A few inches later. Day 2, day 3, day 4. A few moments later. 1 eternity later. 3 days later. 12 seconds later. 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later. Many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow for sure. Eventually, 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
While Patchy pulls himself together, let's see how SpongeBob's party is shaping up. Meanwhile, 2 hours later, 8:01 p.m. The next day. Later, 20 minutes later, 6 hours later, several bad puns later.
70 years later.
Meanwhile, 6 hours later, later that same evening, several days later, 6 months later, 2 hours later, 4 to 6 weeks later, 1 minute, 37 seconds later, 1 debt to society later, 1 pair of pants later, 8 hours later, 298 frozen patties later, 3 hours later, epilogue the next day. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab, 10 seconds later, 346 minutes later, much later, 3 days later, opening night later, 3,000 years later, 1 week later, 7:59 a.m. 3 weeks later, 3 days later, 2 hours later, 48 hours later, 8 hours later, the following Thursday, 5 minutes later, 24 hours later, much later, much later, 7 hours later, epilogue, several song-filled hours later, a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later, 2 hours later, 3 days later, 15 minutes later, several months later, thousands of tears later, 16 paranoia-filled days later, 2 hours later, much later. Yesterday, many hours later, 75 years later, 2 hours later, 1 extremely annoying shift later, 2 very boring minutes later, 3 hours later, 1 winner later, the following day, meanwhile, later, just then. What follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. Meanwhile, back in the lowlands, 1 frozen wasteland later, 1 hour later, 5 hours later, 2 days later, in the void. Approximately 10 hours later, early the next morning, 1 shift later, 2 weeks later, 11 minutes later, 5 minutes later, a lot of boring math later, 24 hours later, 1 week later, 1 long angry line later, 72 hours later, 2 hours later. Just then, by sheer coincidence, the next morning, montage. The next morning, many tic-tacs later, flashback, end of flashback. The very next evening, 1 hour later. The next day, later, 4 to 6 days later, 4 to 6 more days later. The next morning, moments later, more moments later, 1 semester later, graduation day.
1 hour later!
5 minutes later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. Soon after. Later. Moments later. The next morning. Many unbearable hours later. 82 kilometers later. A little later. 3 hours later. 1 season later. Many secret patties later. Moments later. 1 nap later. 1 very long digestive tract later. 6 months later. 1 pathetic sob story later. Later. Many minutes later. 3 hours later. The next morning. 1 shift later. The next day. The next morning. Later. The next... The next morning. Later that night. The next day. 1 weekend of pampering later. 1 hour later. Late again. You get the idea. 8 semesters later.
5,000 celebrities later.
6 months later.
Meanwhile, one little boost to the surface later.
A few minutes later. 1 hour later. 5 million years later.
The next morning. Later that night. The next evening. One operation later. 1 million, zillion, jillion, dillion, cotillion times later. Meanwhile, the next morning. Later. 1 hour later. 7 months later. The next Christmas. Several long days later. Many, many toys later. 12 sleepless hours later. One beautiful Christmas morning later. The next morning, many frame building attempts later, even more boat building attempts later, 1 day later, one humongous meal later, one entree later, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, several bouquets later, 10 hours later, 80 minutes later, many memories later, 1 week later, happy friendiversary. Later, many, many unbearable moments later. The next morning, many adorable hours later. Several days later, much later. 1 week later. Many versions later. 1 week later. Many meeps later. Many plays later. Many superstitions later.
2,000-ish years later.
Many buckets later.
14 hours later. Days later. 237 hours later.
Many hours later.
Many boring hours of cleaning later.
Later that day.
Several soda-filled hours later.
The next level.
Many meeps later.
13 seconds later.
Many painful holes later.
A couple of hours later. Several weeks later. 1 movie later. 6 messy days later.
Meanwhile, the next morning. Many amusements later. 6 hours later.
Our baby has a real holiday today. She will open the whole box with the Kinder surprises. Look, all of them are different. This is a surprise with toys, the fixes. Our baby loves sweet very much and eats chocolate with pleasure. Nolik is the boy fixie of blue color. He loves to make different experiments very much. The next Kinder with a toy from the cartoon Kikoriki. Look, it is Chico. He is serious, well-mannered and very reasonable. We get the following egg. It is from the cartoon Robocar Polly. And in this egg we got Robocar Roy. He is a fire truck. Roy teaches children to safety rules. Guys, do you know what the heroes of the cartoon will be in this Kinder? It is a little elf. His name is Ben, from the cartoon Ben and Holly. Our sweet tooth waits the following Kinder with pleasure. The toy from the collection Num is hidden there. Look how funny he is, the future cosmonaut. There are a lot of kinds of Kinder. There was no repetition of a collection yet. And what is it? It is Tom in a hat, from the animated film Talking Tom and Friends. We get the following Kinder surprise. It has a toy from the Blaze and the Monster Machines collection. Wow! It is the main hero of the cartoon, the monster truck Blaze, a very fast racer. What Kinder will we open further? Baby, take away the chocolate and we continue to open Kinders. It is a Moonzy, very unusual kid who got from the moon to the earth. The following Kinder with toys of very popular animated cartoon The Peppa Pig. And we get the main character, Peppa. She is the eldest daughter in the family, likes to play and, in general, to have a good time. Children, look, we already had such a Kinder. It is interesting. What is the toy in it? It is a Robocar Polly, the main hero of an animated cartoon, the police car, very brave, quick and dexterous. And what's the next? It is a Kinder with the fixes. Let's open it quicker. It is Simka, the elder sister of Nolik, very clever and active, the girl fixie of orange color. We take the following Kinder, we will shake it. And this is Holly, the hero of an animated cartoon Ben and Holly's Little Kingdom. She is the princess of fairies. We have very few Kinders. Let's open them quicker. This is funny Num. He is probably very hungry. What Kinder will we open further? We eat a chocolate. And it is Olga from Kikoriki. She is oval doctor, adores sport and active lifestyle, likes to walk in the open air. What's a pity? There is a last Kinder. And there is a little monster truck named Pickle, of green color. What's a great collection we have? Children, write in comments what toy was pleasant to you most of all. Click on the picture to watch the next cartoon and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.